If I asked you to think of a great example of faith in the Bible, somebody who exhibits that central characteristic of trust in God, I wonder who would come to mind for you. Maybe Abraham comes to mind, the old man who heard God's promise under a desert sky and left everything behind. Or maybe Mary, who heard the angel's message and responded with openness and trust. Or maybe one of the disciples who heard Jesus' call and left their nets by the seashore to follow. You might come up with any number of prophets or dreamers or heroes from the long story of Scripture. But I'm guessing Bartimaeus doesn't quickly come to mind. And maybe he should, because the story that we just heard read from the Gospel of Mark is the story of a person who had pretty incredible faith, who was willing to use his voice to cry out, and who was not deterred by those who tried to silence him, and who was so sure and certain that Jesus meant business that he didn't just politely walk over and kneel at the teacher's feet, but he jumped up and threw off his cloak to the ground. It's Reformation Sunday today, which is a day when the church remembers that central character of our relationship to God is one of faith, of trust in God's gracious love. And so it's not bad that we have Bartimaeus with us today as an example of what that sort of strong and daring faith looks like. The story we heard is very much about his faith and also about this change that took place in him. He began this particular day blind and ended able to see. But if you listen carefully to this story, Bartimaeus is not the only one who undergoes a change on this day. It's also a story of a change that Jesus calls for in his own disciples, in the people who knew him best, who already identify as his followers. And that's where my attention goes this morning. The scene is a pretty familiar one. Jesus and his disciples have attracted a bunch of attention in the town where they've just been. And by the time they leave, it's not just a small band heading out, but a large crowd. And here on the edge of town, in a spot that maybe mirrors his place in society, sits Bartimaeus, a blind man begging by the roadside. And he hears that it's Jesus passing by, and he knows enough of this man's reputation to know that he might be able to help. So he cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." You would think that the disciples and the crowd with him, presumably who have been drawn to Jesus by his compassion and by his ability to heal, you would think that they would stop the procession at this point, right? To make sure that Jesus knows there's somebody over here who's trying to get your attention. You would think that. But no, Mark tells us that in that crowd, many sternly ordered him to be quiet. So why do you think were the disciples, these ones who've been following Jesus, who've been tracing his footsteps with their own, why were these people telling Bartimaeus to quiet down? Did they think Jesus had somewhere more important to be that day? Did they think this simply wasn't how things were done, that if you really wanted to see Jesus, you ought to make an appointment and wait your turn? Did they think there wasn't enough of Jesus' grace to go around? Did they think this particular person, blind and begging and about as close to the fringes as possible, did they think he simply wasn't the sort of person that they wanted around? I don't know. But whatever the reason, the crowds and the disciples with them want Bartimaeus to be quiet, to disappear, to go unheard and unseen. And that is not Jesus' way. He's not worried about being anywhere but right where he is at this moment, stopped in his tracks by the cry of a single person calling for help. He's not particularly concerned with ceremony and manners, not nearly as concerned as the church that grew up after him. He's not bound by anxieties about scarcity. He's not worried that the well of life is going to run dry. And he certainly isn't doubting whether this person from the fringes belongs in company with him. Mark uses few words at this point in the story, but they are sacred ones to read slowly. After the disciples tried to silence him, Bartimaeus shouts out even more loudly, loud enough for Jesus to hear this time, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And here's what Mark says happened next. Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." Those words gave me pause this week. Because at first they seemed a little strange. I mean, if Jesus heard this guy's cry and intended to do something about it, why didn't he just go over himself? Why didn't he part the crowds and walk over to this man in need? It all sounded just a little bit aloof of me, a little bit aloof to me, a little bit out of character for Jesus. But here's the thing. When Jesus tells the disciples to go and call the man over, he is giving them something to do. He's giving them a role to play. And of course, that means he's asking them to change. These very same disciples who were snapping at Bartimaeus to be quiet only a moment ago are now supposed to change their tune quite dramatically. This is all a little bit awkward, isn't it? "Excuse me, Bartimaeus, I know we just told you to quiet down, but never mind, Jesus wants to see you." Christian life is about lots of things. It's about joy, of course. Maybe more than anything, it's about joy. But along the way, it is very much about the sort of experience the disciples have here, of being called out on the limitations of our imagination when it comes to God's love. It's about Jesus stopping in his tracks and saying to us, "You know that person you think is beyond grace? Get over yourself. Call him here. Call her here." Eugene Peterson died this past week. You might know him as the person who did the Message translation of the Bible, which has been read all over the English-speaking world. In addition to being a translator, he's also a prolific author and a parish pastor for many years. And many people, including me, are feeling his loss right now. And among the many beautiful excerpts from his writing that are going around right now is this short passage from his book, Practice Resurrection. "Nothing and no one is a mere object," he writes, "a thing that we can ignore or dispose of as we like. This is resurrection country. Resurrection is not something that we add on to everything we are already accustomed to. It makes alive what had been dead through trespasses and sins. It's understandable that we will still carry old cemetery habits and assumptions into the resurrection country. We have, after all, been living with them a long time, if you can call it living. And so we require a patient, long-suffering reorientation in the resurrection conditions that prevail in this country, living into the full stature of Christ." Peterson's words about bringing our cemetery habits and assumptions, where everything that's dead stays dead, bringing those things into resurrection country helps me make sense of our gospel story this morning. I mean, there's a part of me that wants to take the disciples by the shoulders and look them in the eyes and say, "Can't you see how ridiculous you're being? Don't you get it? It's only a chapter earlier in Mark that children were coming to see Jesus and the disciples were sternly talking to them. And of course, Jesus said, 'Quit getting in their way. Let them come to me.' And now here they are again, sternly ordering Bartimaeus to stay away. Can't you see what you're doing? I want to ask. Can't you all just get out of Jesus' way?" It's easy for me to say that. But of course, I've got my own cemetery habits and assumptions that I carry around as well. My own ideas about who is deserving of grace, and whose there is room for, and who is a lost cause. And I have my own dismissive ways and my own concerns for efficiency and worries about there not being enough to go around. That's what I see happening here with the disciples. They are lugging their old ways around with them, and Jesus doesn't just say, "Stand back, I'll fix this." He looks at his followers with love and says yet again, "You've got more to learn. This is resurrection country, and you are going to participate in this work with me. You've got a role to play. So you go and call him here." I have to admit that my heart is a little heavy this morning with news of Jewish people in my home country murdered while at worship yesterday, with worry over the increasingly bitter and ugly divisions taking place in so many of our societies, with the way minorities, immigrants, and refugees are so easily demonized and scapegoated today. There's a lot that can seem pretty hopeless right now. And in the midst of all that, here is where I continue to find hope today. It's in the persistent call to participate in the work of healing. There's a passage from the Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism, that's being shared around these days, and I think it says it beautifully. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. Jesus calls us to live that way, to make some gesture with our own lives, however small, toward a more just and loving world where no one is disposed of, to offer an encouraging word, to listen to those often ignored, to vote, to advocate, to embrace. I find hope in that continued calling that is on each of our lives. And I find hope in your baptism this morning, Nina. I find hope in God's presence in your life, in the promise that resurrection life is at work in you, in the reminder your baptism gives all of us that we belong to Christ and to each other. I find hope in the assurance that love is always our home and always our calling. We cannot measure how God heals in this world that is scarred by so much grief. But we trust that God's grace continues to respond in ways beyond our imaginations. And we offer ourselves again today, trusting that we too have a role to play. Amen.